The morning Diana left, she said nothing. She placed the divorce papers on the kitchen table, left the car keys beside them, a car she had quietly transferred into her own name 3 months before, and walked out without looking back. Elijah sat down on the kitchen floor, back against the empty refrigerator, and counted the money in his wallet. He counted it twice, $73. Outside stood a rusted garage, peeling tin roof, rolling door stuck halfway open. Nobody knew that 1 year later, that garage would become the very thing Diana would beg to own. Stay with this. What Elijah did next will make you reconsider everything you think you know about. Starting over. Elijah had met Diana at an industry trade event in the spring of 2018. He was 31 years old and working as an independent mechanical engineer, picking up contracts from manufacturers who needed short-term technical expertise without the overhead of a full-time hire. He was not wealthy, but he was capable, and his reputation among the mid-sized production facilities in the region had been earned slowly and held carefully. Diana was 29 sharp, and already moving quickly up the marketing ladder at a large consumer goods company. She had the kind of energy that fills a room before the person enters it, and when she laughed, the people nearby would laugh without being entirely sure why. They fell into each other quickly and easily, the way two people do when the timing feels right and neither of them is looking hard enough to see what they might be trading away. They married in the summer of 2020, a ceremony that was small and practical and, by the accounts of everyone present, genuinely happy. Elijah turned down a 16-month engineering contract in Germany to stay. Diana never asked him to do it. He did it because he believed that building a life together meant choosing proximity over opportunity, at least for a while. That belief, held quietly, was the first sacrifice she would never fully credit him for. The early years were not bad. Elijah worked from the garage, taking on repair and diagnostic contracts for industrial machinery, conveyor transmission units, hydraulic drive assemblies, pneumatic press couplings. The work was inconsistent but not unreliable, and in most months the income covered what it needed to cover. Diana's career, meanwhile, moved in one direction only. Her title changed twice in 3 years. Her salary grew by a number that surprised even her: client trips, cross-department leadership roles, invitations to closed-door strategic sessions. The professional architecture of her life was building itself upward with impressive speed. And with that growth came a new social world, colleagues who wore expensive shoes and drove vehicles that cost more than Elijah had earned in the previous 2 years combined. None of that would have mattered on its own. What mattered was the thing that happened inside Diana, gradually, quietly, without her ever consciously choosing it. She began to see Elijah through the eyes of the people around her. She began to measure the garage, the flannel shirts, the uneven monthly income, the grease-shadowed knuckles against the clean professional surfaces of the world she had moved into. And through that comparative lens, the picture was not flattering. Sebastian was a financial director at Diana's company, 42 days older than her, well-dressed in the way that people register without analyzing, confident without apparent effort, the kind of man who made other men feel like they had arrived underprepared to something they had not known was a competition. He began appearing at the same after-work gatherings Diana attended, first as a face across a crowded table, then as a regular at the edge of her conversations, then as the person she called when she needed a second opinion on something she did not want to bring home. Elijah noticed the shift before he had a name for it. Diana came home later. She answered questions with fewer words. She stopped asking about his work. And when he volunteered updates, a promising contract lead, a new client relationship, a job that had gone well, she would nod in the way a person nods when they are waiting for a sentence to end rather than listening while it unfolds. One evening, at a dinner gathering with Diana's colleagues, Elijah arrived without thinking to change out of the flannel shirt he had worn to the garage that afternoon. He caught Diana looking at his hands, scrubbed clean but still faintly marked at the knuckles, where machine oil had worked itself too deep over too many years to fully wash away. She said nothing, but the look took less than a second and communicated a paragraph. She said something to him once, near the end, that he turned over in his mind long after she was gone. They had been discussing his work, and the conversation had gone flat the way those conversations had been going for months. And Diana had said quietly, without cruelty in her tone, "I don't need you to be rich, Elijah." I just need you to want more for yourself. He had taken it as support. He had taken it as encouragement, as the caring concern of someone who believed in his potential. It was only later, sitting in the dark of the garage after she had left, that he understood what she had actually been saying. She was ashamed of him. Not of who he was as a person. She was not built for simple cruelty, but ashamed of what he looked like against the backdrop of the world she now occupied. And she had wrapped that shame in language that sounded like encouragement, because she had not quite let herself see it for what it was. It was easier to call it concern. It was easier to believe she was pushing him upward rather than stepping away from what he was. The week before the divorce papers appeared on the kitchen table, Elijah had called her from the garage to tell her about a new service contract, a transmission, assembly overhaul at a local manufacturing plant, several weeks of solid work, decent pay. He had been genuinely pleased. Diana had set her phone face down on the counter and listened, and when he finished, she asked how much the contract was worth. He told her. She was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone calculating a number against expectations they have not stated out loud. 3 days later, she came home late. The house was quiet in a way that felt decided. She sat down at the kitchen table without pouring a glass of water, without removing her coat. She looked at him and said, "Elijah, I want a divorce." He did not argue. He did not beg or negotiate or ask for time. He asked one question only, whether Sebastian had anything to do with it. She did not answer directly. The non-answer was precise. The papers appeared on the table on a Tuesday morning 4 days later, beside the keys to a car that had not been jointly owned for some time. The week after Diana left was the quietest week of Elijah's adult life. He did not call his family. He did not reach out to old friends to describe what had happened or solicit their sympathy. He handled the divorce paperwork himself, sitting at the kitchen table each evening with a pen and a cup of coffee that went cold while he read through the documents carefully. He took his time. He initialed and signed and filed what needed to be filed. On the third evening, he went to the garage, turned on the fluorescent light. It had always flickered slightly, a rhythm he had stopped noticing years ago, and sat down on an overturned bucket with a piece of paper on his knee. He performed a deliberate inventory of what existed, $73 in his wallet. A 12-year collection of industrial hand tools, the good kind, accumulated with purpose across a career that had not made him famous but had taught him to read, failed machinery the way other people read faces. 1 cordless drill, 2 battery packs, a laptop computer 3 years past its best condition. A wooden crate of miscellaneous drivetrain components salvaged from previous jobs with vague intentions and no specific plan. And the garage itself, 40 square meters of cracked concrete and aging tin, 1 broken door spring, 1 leaking roof corner. Diana had looked at this space on the morning of her departure and said, as though concluding a thought she had been carrying for a long time, "You should think about selling that. Nobody's going to rent property out here." Then she had driven away. The sound of the car turning at the end of the block was the last thing Elijah registered before the neighborhood went quiet again. He called Lucas that same week. It was the only call he made to anyone beyond what the paperwork required. Lucas was the one friend Elijah had who did not soften things unnecessarily. They had known each other since their mid-20s, worked adjacent industrial sites on a handful of occasions, built the kind of friendship that required neither regular maintenance nor significant explanation. Lucas did freelance welding and fabrication work, owned a metal lathe and a reliable MIG welder, and had no patience for conversations that described a problem at length without attempting to solve it. He drove over the afternoon Elijah called, sat on an upended plastic crate in the garage, and listened without interjecting while Elijah gave him the full account. The marriage, the end of it, Diana's departure, the $73, the current state of everything. When Elijah finished talking, Lucas looked at the tools on the wall and the parts crate in the corner for a moment without speaking. Then he asked, "What do you still have?" Elijah pointed at the tools, at the parts, at the laptop. Lucas nodded once and said, "That's enough to begin." Elijah said he had no capital and no clear direction. Lucas said, "Then start with the direction and the capital comes after." That night, after Lucas had gone, Elijah sat alone under the flickering light and let Diana's words visit him one more time, ones about being satisfied with just enough. For the first time, they did not produce sadness. They produced something sharper and more useful. They produce the specific kind of anger that is less about the person who said the thing and more about the part of yourself that suspects. Privately, they might not have been entirely wrong. Elijah wrote 2 questions at the top of a blank piece of paper. The first, what do I have? The second, what does the market actually need? The first question he could already answer. For the second, he spent 3 days reviewing every industrial job he had completed in the previous 4 years, pulling invoices and notes from a folder he kept in the garage cabinet, looking for the friction point that had always been there, but that he had never sat still long enough to study systematically. The pattern, once he looked for it, was not subtle. Mid-sized manufacturing facilities, the kind operating on narrow margins with aging equipment and maintenance budgets that did not allow for expensive surprises, had a persistent and costly problem with drivetrain component failure. When a hydraulic drive coupling or a planetary transmission assembly failed, ordering a replacement through the original manufacturer meant a lead time of 6 to 12 weeks and a cost that regularly exceeded several $1,000s per unit. The machine sat idle, production stopped, revenue bled by the day, and the operators absorbed the loss because they believed there was no faster option. What almost none of them had access to in the region was the service Elijah had been providing informally and incompletely for years. Taking the failed component apart, isolating the specific point of failure, machining or rebuilding that element to original specification, and returning a fully functional assembly at 60% of replacement cost and a fraction of the lead time. It was not a complicated concept. It required precision, patience, and the kind of accumulated mechanical knowledge that takes a decade to develop and cannot be purchased. It required a garage and a set of tools, both already existed. The problem was capital. Even the basic material costs for a first rebuild job ran to several $100s, and $73 was not several hundred. Elijah did not approach a bank. His credit history after the joint accounts had been settled in. The divorce was not in a condition to support a loan, and the timeline for a business loan application was measured in months he did not have. Instead, he drove out to Jason's facility on a Tuesday morning. Jason operated a small production floor with 8 employees and machinery that, by any objective standard, had been running on borrowed time for at least a decade. He had a rotary drive assembly that had been failed and idle for 8 weeks, waiting on a replacement part from the original supplier. The downtime was costing Jason roughly $1,500 per day in lost output. Elijah examined the failed assembly for 40 minutes, asked 3 specific questions, and made a proposal $400 paid up front, and Elijah would deliver a rebuilt assembly meeting original specification within 10 days. If the rebuilt unit failed the specification test, Jason paid nothing further. If it performed correctly, Jason would pay $600 additional on delivery, a total of $1,000, against a replacement cost of more than $4,000 and a remaining wait of 4 or more additional weeks. Jason looked at the machine. He looked at Elijah. He said he would consider it overnight. He called the following morning and said yes. What followed was 10 days of work that Elijah would not describe as difficult so much as completely consuming. He and Lucas ran 14 to 16 hours each day. On the 3rd day it rained, and the corner of the roof that leaked made itself known, and they positioned a cardboard box on the floor to collect the drip and kept working without discussion. The fluorescent light flickered its familiar rhythm. The tools moved through their purposes with the efficiency of hands that had done this kind of work long enough that thought and motion operated at the same speed. Elijah measured everything twice, recorded every specification in a new spiral notebook he had bought for $2 at a pharmacy, and documented the rebuild process step by step with the intention of repeating it reliably rather than the hope of getting lucky once. On the evening of the 9th day, he ran the finished assembly through a full bench test. Every measurement came back within tolerance. He ran the test again to confirm it. On the afternoon of the 10th day, he drove the assembly to Jason's facility and watched 2 of Jason's maintenance technicians install it. The machine started. It did not start hesitantly or noisily or with the various small protests that old equipment offers when it is not fully ready. It ran cleanly and smoothly, exactly as the specification required. Jason stood with his arms folded, watching the output line move for a long, quiet moment. Then he turned to Elijah. He said, "You want more work?" Elijah said, Write me a contract. Jason pulled a legal pad out of a desk drawer and wrote one by hand right. There, 3 additional assemblies. Same terms and conditions. Elijah signed it before leaving the building. The first 3 months were about survival and nothing more ambitious than that. Covering rent and utilities. Buying materials for each job from the payment received for the previous one. Building the work habit that required no external enforcement because the alternative was worse than the effort. Elijah created a 3-stage quality control process and documented it in the spiral notebook. Incoming component assessment, mid-rebuild dimensional verification, final specification test and sign-off. Every component that left the garage had a handwritten record. In the second month, one rebuilt unit failed 48 hours after delivery. A bearing had been pressed to specification but not beyond it, and an edge case stress condition had found the gap. Elijah received the call in the early morning, drove to the facility before the client's shift supervisor had finished his second cup of coffee, looked the man directly in the eye, and acknowledged the failure without softening it or providing context that might have sounded like an excuse. He told the supervisor he would have a corrected unit back within 4 days at no additional charge. He delivered it in 2. The client did not terminate the relationship. He gave Elijah 2 referrals within the following 3 weeks. Elijah wrote that evening in the spiral notebook, "A failure handled with full ownership is remembered longer than a success handled without one." By the close of the 3rd month, revenue had exceeded $6,000 for the first time in a single month. Elijah paid Lucas formally for the first time, a real invoice, a documented payment, a simple operating agreement that named Lucas as technical partner with a small equity share. He signed a lease on an adjoining storage unit that shared a wall with the garage and converted it into additional workshop space over the course of a weekend. He bought a used benchtop press from an estate sale for $80, recalibrated it over one evening, and added it to the workshop without ceremony. The word-of-mouth network among plant operators and maintenance managers in the industrial corridor moved faster than Elijah had anticipated. He received a call from a facility he had never contacted, asking whether he handled pneumatic press assemblies. He said yes, spent an evening updating his process documentation for that component category, and took the contract. He brought in 2 additional component types that same month. The spiral notebook accumulated entries, not just specifications and measurements, but observations, what failure modes appeared most often in humid conditions, which component manufacturers used tolerances that aged poorly, which facilities ran their machinery hardest and would therefore generate the most repeat business. Elijah was building a body of knowledge, not just a service list, and he understood the difference. It was in the 5th month that Owen appeared, without announcement, driving a plain work truck and carrying a failed air compressor assembly from a personal workshop. He was 58 years old, recently retired from a career that had included building and eventually selling a precision machining operation with more than 200 employees. He sat on a stool in the corner of the garage and watched Elijah work for nearly 2 hours, asking no questions, making no comments, apparently content simply to observe. Elijah had almost stopped registering his presence when Owen finally spoke. He said, "You are not just fixing components, you are building a system. Do you understand the difference?" Elijah looked up from the bench. He said he was not sure he did. Owen said, "Come have coffee when you're done with that." The conversation that followed ran 3 hours and rearranged several things in Elijah's understanding of what he was building and where it was going. Owen did not offer money at first. What he offered was time and network, and at that stage both were worth more than capital. He introduced Elijah to 4 plant operations managers in the adjacent industrial park who had been circling the same component failure problem for years without a local solution. He reviewed Elijah's pricing structure and told him plainly that he was undercharging by close to 30% across the board, not because Elijah did not understand the value of the work, but because he had been setting prices based on what he thought clients would accept rather than what the service was actually worth. He sat with Elijah for an afternoon and reviewed every service contract currently in place, flagging 4 liability clauses that were unnecessarily unfavorable and 2 payment terms that created cash flow risk. None of it came as a lecture. Owen described the mistakes with the particular efficiency of someone who has made them already and sees no value in watching another person repeat them. Elijah raised his prices across the board in the following month. He did not lose a client. The company registered formally in the 7th month as Ironside Industrial Rebuild, a limited liability company. Elijah chose the name alone, sitting at the kitchen table with a blank page in front of him for most of an hour, writing possibilities and crossing them out. He needed something that carried weight without being decorative. Iron because the work was honest and because the material that ran through every job was one of the oldest in human manufacturing. It did not pretend to be more than it was. Side because everything Elijah had ever built had been built at the edge of resources, at the margin between what was available and what was needed, in the space that other people did not consider worth occupying. The name went on a simple website, a list of services, the categories of components handled, a brief description of the rebuild process, and a contact form. No photographs of Elijah. No founder story, no language about mission or vision. Just the information a plant manager needed to decide whether to make a call. By the time the site went live, Ironside already had more work pending than its current team could complete. Elijah hired 2 technicians. He interviewed both of them himself, sitting across the workbench in the workshop, asking questions that required explanation rather than yes or no answers. He was looking for people who could say not just what they would do to a failed component, but why the approach would work. People whose understanding of mechanical failure was intuitive enough to be reliable under pressure. Both hires stayed, neither gave him reason to reconsider. Lucas was formally elevated to shop supervisor and given an additional equity share. Conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes because Elijah had already decided the outcome before he started it. Lucas accepted without negotiation and went back to the bench. Elijah remained on the floor. He did not graduate to an office when the company grew enough to justify one. He did not stop doing hands-on technical work once there were employees capable of doing it instead. He ate lunch at the workbench most days alongside the team, sitting on the same stools everyone else used, talking about the jobs in progress and occasionally about nothing related to work. He was the last person to leave on most evenings and the first to arrive on most mornings. He set no policy about this and announced it to no one. He simply did it, and the team understood what it meant without being told. There is a particular kind of authority that cannot be given by a title or taken away by a bad quarter. It is the kind built by consistency, by the willingness to be present for the unglamorous parts of the work without signaling that you consider it beneath you. Elijah had that. He had always had it. It had just never had a company around it before. In the 8th month, Owen made a formal investment offer, $80,000 in exchange for 15% equity in Ironside. Elijah countered at 12%. Owen accepted without extended negotiation, which told Elijah, in the silence that followed the acceptance, that the original offer had been deliberately soft. Elijah noted the lesson and moved on. The capital went into a precision measurement instrument package that upgraded the workshop's accuracy capabilities, an expanded second-floor space leased from the building next door, and the first hire of an operations coordinator who could manage scheduling, invoicing, and client communication while Elijah focused on the technical direction of the work. The accounting for month 8 showed the clearest picture Elijah had seen yet of what Ironside was actually becoming. He spent an hour with the numbers before closing the ledger. By the end of the 11th month, Ironside had signed its first recurring service agreements, quarterly maintenance contracts with 2 mid-sized manufacturing facilities that provided predictable monthly revenue for the first time. The company employed 8 people. 3 industrial distributors had made preliminary contact about potential partnership arrangements that Owen had advised Elijah to evaluate carefully rather than pursue quickly. Geographic expansion was under active discussion. Servicing facilities in neighboring states was not a theoretical future possibility anymore. It was a practical question of timing and sequencing. 2 equipment manufacturers had reached out independently, both interested in whether Ironside might operate as a certified alternative rebuild source for specific component lines. Elijah had not made decisions on any of those conversations. He was listening carefully, the way Owen had taught him to listen, without the urgency of someone who needs the next thing to happen quickly, but with the focus of someone who understands that the right decision and the fast decision are rarely the same thing. The total revenue for the first year, when the final month's invoices cleared, came to just over $410,000. Elijah closed the accounting notebook, set it on the workbench, and looked out across the shop floor. 8 people moving through a clean, well-organized space, components traveling through the rebuild cycle with the calm efficiency of something that had been designed deliberately. He thought about Diana's comment on the morning she left, the one about the garage, about no one renting property out here. He held the thought for a moment without judgment. Then he set it down and walked back to the bench. Sebastian worked in industrial finance. He reviewed market analyses and supplier outlook reports as part of his regular professional routine, and the name Ironside Industrial Rebuild appeared in his field of view not because he was looking for it but because it was there, referenced in a regional procurement intelligence report as one of several emerging suppliers beginning to disrupt the traditional component replacement supply chain. The address in the report matched a zip code Sebastian recognized. The founder name matched a name Sebastian knew. He set his laptop down on the coffee table and was quiet in a way that Diana noticed from across the room. She asked what he was reading, he told her. She waited until he had moved to the kitchen, then opened her own laptop and began searching. She read the trade publication profile twice. She found the Ironside website and read every page. She found 3 client testimonials posted in an industry forum, short, flat, practical paragraphs from maintenance directors describing turnaround times and component performance in the unsentimental language of people who praise only what has genuinely earned it. She found one photograph posted by a client independently, the Ironside workshop floor, organized and clean, the kind of space that communicates competence not through design but through discipline. She looked at that photograph for longer than she intended. The feeling that arose in her was not one feeling but several competing at once, something adjacent to regret, something adjacent to professional respect, and underneath both of those something harder to name. The specific discomfort of having made a confident prediction about a person and having been wrong, in a way that cannot be appealed. She opened a new search window and typed a question about Ironside's investor structure. She looked at what came back. Then she picked up her phone and found Elijah's contact, still saved under the same name, and sat with it for a long moment. She called on a Thursday evening, 11 months after the divorce. Elijah was at the workbench when the phone screen lit up with her name. He looked at it through 2 rings. He set it face up on the bench and watched it ring 2 more times. Then he answered. Diana's voice carried the same precise quality he remembered, professional composure in the vowels. Each sentence delivered with the clarity of someone accustomed to speaking in rooms where people are measuring the words. She congratulated him on the business. She said she had come across information about Ironside and wanted him to know it was impressive. He thanked her briefly and asked what she was calling about specifically. She said she had a proposal she wanted to discuss in person if he was open to it. He said he would think about it. He called her back the following morning and gave her a date and a coffee shop. She arrived composed in the way that requires preparation. She had brought a leather folder with a 2-page printed document inside, a formal investment proposal, researched and correctly formatted, the numbers drawn from accurate data, the logic internally consistent. She wanted to acquire an equity stake in Ironside. She was prepared to invest $120,000 in exchange for between 10 and 15% of the company. She made her case without theatrics and without sentimentality. Elijah listened to the full presentation without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her one question. If the garage still had a broken spring on the door and I was still doing repair jobs on my own, would you be sitting here today? Diana looked down at her coffee cup. She did not answer immediately. She looked up after a moment and began a sentence that did not arrive anywhere. The silence between the incomplete sentence and the next moment held everything. Elijah did not fill it. He did not need her to find the words. The shape of the silence was the answer, and both of them knew it. What followed was not anger. That was the thing about Elijah that the people who knew him well understood. He did not perform his emotional responses for an audience, and he did not allow the weight of a loaded moment to push him toward the obvious gesture. He was not going to tell Diana she had been wrong. That would have been accurate, and it would have served no purpose he could name. He was not going to describe the $73 or the cardboard box under the leaking roof. The story was not about humiliating her and had never been. He said, "You're capable. You understand business. But I think you're trying to invest in something you already chose to leave, and that's a different transaction than the one you're describing," Diana pressed. She raised the offer to $150,000. She mentioned her professional network, the client relationships she could potentially leverage, the distribution contacts through her company's industry positioning. Elijah shook his head without heat, without performance. "I have Owen, I have Jason, I have Lucas." The people around Ironside were chosen carefully, and that doesn't change because the number on a check gets larger. He stood up, extended his hand across the table, and thanked her for the meeting. She shook his hand. The handshake lasted the length of a breath. When he walked out of the coffee shop, he did not look back. He drove back to the workshop and found Lucas running a final torque verification on a rebuilt planetary assembly. Lucas looked up, read something in Elijah's expression without difficulty, and said, "She asked to buy in, didn't she?" Not a question. Lucas said, and Elijah said, "I told her Ironside isn't taking new investors at this time." Lucas turned back to the assembly and said, without inflection, "Same as no." They finished the afternoon without returning to the subject. That weekend, Elijah drove out to Owen's house. He told the story plainly and completely, without commentary. Owen listened until it was finished. Then he asked which kind of answer Elijah wanted, the business one or the other kind. Elijah said both. The business answer was direct. Ironside did not need the capital. If Diana brought genuine operational value, specific expertise, verifiable relationships that served Ironside's actual expansion path, it was worth considering. But $150,000 from someone whose primary contribution was a professional network that overlapped incidentally with Ironside's market was not a compelling offer. There were cleaner sources of capital accessible to a company with Ironside's current trajectory, and clean sources did not carry complicated history. The other answer Owen gave was quieter and took fewer words. He said some distances are not made by time or geography, they are made by choices. She made hers. You made yours. You are not required to close a distance that was opened by someone else's decision. Elijah nodded. He sent Diana an email from his work address that evening. 4 sentences, no personal content. Ironside was not currently opening a round to new investors. Should a suitable opportunity arise in the future, he would be in touch through official channels. He wished her well, that was all. Professional, clean, and final in a way that did not need to announce itself as final. On the last Saturday of the year, exactly 12 months after the morning Diana had set the keys on the kitchen table and walked away, Elijah and Lucas were sitting in the original garage. Not the expanded workshop, not the leased floor space, not the second building. The original 40 square meters, the tin roof now properly patched, the rolling door operating on a new spring, the workbench where it had always been, the spiral notebook sitting at the end of it in the first of its 3 accumulated volumes. They were sitting on overturned buckets drinking beer from bottles, which was the tradition on the evenings when there was nowhere either of them needed to be. They had not planned to be there. They had simply both shown up independently, as though the garage had sent a message to each of them separately and they had both read it, without discussing it. Lucas raised his bottle toward the ceiling and said, "You remember the cardboard box?" Elijah said he did. Lucas said he thought they should have framed it. Elijah said, "It's in the cabinet." "I kept it." Lucas looked at him for a moment. Elijah said, "It's useful to have something that remembers the distance from." Lucas took a drink and looked at the wall for a while. He did not disagree. Ironside closed the year with $410,000 in total revenue. 8 full-time employees, 3 long-term service contracts. 2 manufacturer conversations about certified rebuild partnerships that had moved beyond preliminary discussion. A formal expansion plan for 2 additional regions, drafted by Owen and reviewed by Elijah over 3 Saturday mornings with a legal pad and a pot of coffee. An ISO certification process underway, slow and deliberate, because Elijah had decided the year before that the goal was not to grow as fast as possible but to build something that held its quality at every size. Every decision was that kind of decision, less dramatic than it might have looked from outside, more considered than it appeared in retrospect, made by a person who had learned to use time the way a good mechanic uses tools, precisely, without waste, without performing the gesture. He never published the story. He never announced the revenue figures. He never offered the arc of the 12 months as a demonstration of anything to anyone he did not know personally. He did one thing publicly on the last day of the year. He posted a single photograph to the Ironside business page, the workshop nameplate on the wall, the workbench visible behind it, one of the technicians in the background performing something that looked like actual work. The caption was 2 words only, "Still here," no story attached. Just the name on the wall, the light in the workshop, and 2 words that contained, for anyone who needed to understand them, everything that had been decided and built and held onto across 12 months that began with $73 and a garage that Diana had looked at on her way out the door and decided was not worth taking. Diana read the post that evening, sitting with her phone in the apartment she and Sebastian shared. She looked at the photograph for a while. Then she set the phone face down on the table and did not pick it up again that night. What she felt in that moment is not recorded anywhere, and Elijah would not have needed to know. He had already moved to the part of the story where her opinion of him had stopped being a variable worth measuring. The garage still stood, the tools still hung on the back wall. The spiral notebooks, 3 of them now, each one dense with measurements and process notes and the specific kind of knowledge that cannot be transferred between people except through the slow work of failed components and corrected approaches and early mornings in a space that no one else believed in at the beginning. On the last evening of the year, Elijah walked through the original garage one final time, running his hand along the edge of the workbench, the way you touch something you want to stay with. He turned off the fluorescent light. He rolled the door down fully, smoothly, the new spring doing exactly what it was supposed to do without complaint. He stood outside in the quiet for a moment, listening to the neighborhood settle around him. Then he got in his truck and drove home. Some people look at what a person is carrying and see only the weight of it. What they almost never see is that the person doing the carrying already knows where it goes.